So we leap into an airplane and take off, and bang, right off the end of the runway, the local radar waterfall said, we think the most likely area is a couple of miles east and north. And we hustled out there. Well, I didn't hustle. Doing maybe, I don't know, 250 knots. It wasn't the time to go fast. In and out of cloud, in and out of rain showers. Bumpier in hell. And ceiling, as I recall, was in the order of 500 feet. So I was trying to stay under that and not get my feet wet.
So you would have been basically pitch black.
Pitch black.
On instruments.
On instruments all the time.
500 feet or less.
Didn't
over the ocean.
Yes.
Oh wow.
And occasionally no visibility.
And about 250 knots. You said you could slow down.
Yeah,
to?
250 was very comfortable.
Okay.
And so I said to my nav, I said, I can't look out. I got to fly on instruments all the time here.
Yeah.
I don't dare look out. You look out. And so he had a pretty good view, and I was going like this. And after, I don't know, 5 minutes, he says, there's a light. Oh. So I then looked out, and sure enough, down there in the middle of this boiling sea was a white light, surprisingly bright. And I said, because I wasn't a genius, I said, well, maybe it's a small fishing boat. Out in a night like that, not a chance.
Yeah.
And I said, and I can't believe he has a flashlight. If whoever it is, if he's bailed out, and he's in the water, and so what the hell is the light? I never knew there was a light on the Mae West.
Oh.
I didn't know that.
Oh wow. Okay.
So anyway, I said, it's most unlikely a flashlight. Could be a small fishing boat. Stupid boy. And I called up Waterfall and said, we have a light. I don't think it's anything. And I told him why. But you might as well get our position. Well, the guy at the Waterfall radar controller was a hell of a lot smarter than I was. He got our position, and in the meantime, as soon as the guys had bailed out, they had alerted the Mounties at Campbell River, which is 40 or so miles up the coast. So, and then he immediately called the Mounties and said, we need help for a rescue. In the meantime, I circled the light a couple of times. As it turned out, it was a pilot, a guy named John Callahan, and he had managed to get into his dinghy, and he was quite surprised when the light came on, which was in the dinghy, but he was half dead from cold. Water temperature really cold. So I said, I'm going to look for a better light. so I swung out over there, and I left him. Which incidentally, when I talked to him later, he said, why did you leave me? And I said, well, I was looking for another light. And he said, I have never felt so lonely in my life.
Oh, I bet.
But I left him and went out and searched and searched and searched in the Georgia Strait for close to an hour, saw nothing. And came back and landed. Didn't even look for the light I'd had because God knows where it was, because it would drifted a lot. In the meantime, and I landed, and nobody said boo, and I just went to bed and said goodbye. I didn't know anything about it. And the Mounties had a 42-foot ship at Campbell River, which was their presence for the whole of the West Coast. And they had a crew, and they were underway. They had been on standby. Those guys, there was a crew of 4 and a captain, and they were on their way to the position of the light, and they'd been called by Waterfall radar. And they went out into that awful storm, and it was a southeaster, so the waves were coming right at them in the swell. Oh my God. And I don't know how long it took them to get there, but they couldn't have been going as fast as they would have liked. But they did get there. And they went straight to the light. The reason I know that is I found out there was later when I was writing this story, and I forget how I found out, but there was a member of the crew living at Powell River, a retired Mountie. And he was a crewman on that boat. So he told me their story, which I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, saw the light, the skipper came up alongside on the windward side and held it there, no mean feat.
Yeah.
And he said there were three of us, and we hooked on to Callahan and hauled him up, and we couldn't get him in because he was still attached to his parachute,
Oh, jeez.
and it weighed a ton.
Yeah.
And he said, so we dropped him back in, and he was half dead by now.
Yeah.
He'd been in the water at least an hour, probably more, and
Yeah.
God knows how he was still alive. So he said we dropped him back in the water, we got a knife, we hooked into him again, brought him up far enough to cut the shroud lines, which took a while, and then we dropped him in again because we were tired, and they were holding him. And meanwhile, the boat is in this storm, and all they have to keep them from going overboard is a cable. About, you know how the cables
Yeah.
run along the side of a ship, and they're about amidships, and there's a cable about 3 or 4 feet, and they were hanging onto the cable with one arm and reaching with the other, 3 of them with the other arm. So now they dropped him in twice, and the third time they got him and hauled him aboard, and he was a heavy load because he was wearing a winter flying suit and
Yeah.
boots and all the rest of it. Probably maybe, I don't forget whether he was still tied to his dinghy. They hauled him in, took him downstairs, stripped him, wrapped him in blankets. Incidentally, they found he was carrying a sidearm.
Mhm.
A lot of, I don't know how many pilots at Comox carried a sidearm. I did not. It was very sensible. If you bailed out and came down in the mountains, a sidearm could be a very valuable tool
Mhm.
to signal
Yep.
and to shoot grizzly bears
Mhm.
or cougars or anything else that wanted to eat you.
Mm-hmm.
And it made a lot of sense, and I know more than a few carried sidearms. So when they stripped Callahan, they found a sidearm. I don't know what velocity or what it was, and they agreed they would say nothing about the sidearm.
Because he wasn't supposed to have it.
I got a hunch there was some law.
Okay.
I don't know what it was. It was not issued by the government, so nobody expected you to carry a sidearm.
Gotcha.
But they understood. So he was half dead, very cold. They took him into Comox, and he got transferred to the hospital. And then when I was talking to him later, what was interesting is he was a very young guy. There's pictures in one of those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Good-looking guy, about, I think he was 21 maybe.
Okay.
He had been in Dawson Creek, I was told. He was a kind of a major swimmer.
Okay.
He was kid was built like a brick, you know, so he was at home in the water, which probably saved his life.
No kidding.
And after a couple of weeks, he went back flying. And prior to the accident, he was a happy-go-lucky guy, not much of a drinker like most of us weren't. It was the World War II guys that were drinkers. Maybe with good cause.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably.
Yeah. But something was wrong with John after the accident. Nobody had ever invented PTSD by then, but you knew there was something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, I don't quite know how, why, or where, but he left. And I think somebody said he became the announcer for the Golden Hawks like not flying anymore.
Okay.
I don't think there's any doubt that accident was as close to death as you want to come. Left a mark on him.
Well, especially I think being alone in the Georgia Strait and all those conditions. That sounds very terrifying.
Well, not only that, but then your son of a bitching squadron mate left.
Yeah.
And he wanted me to stick around.
Yeah.
He felt some comfort from that CF-100 flying around over top of him.
Now, did they ever find the navigator?
No.
Okay.
They found his ejection seat. His ejection seat, funnily enough, fell into a farmer's chicken coop near the shore, and the farmer sued and said all the chickens fell over dead, which who was to argue, and so he got compensated not only for his chicken coop, but for his dead chickens. They think McLaren, who was a tall red-headed guy, was Red McLaren, may have used the alternate ejection handle. You had one over here, which pulled a screen over your face. Then you had a second one between your legs, which for a tall guy would have to do this. And there was no time delay. And they told us, anybody who uses the alternate ejection handle is probably going to break his back, because we were fired out of there with an explosive device. Later they became a slow burning explosive device, but the ejection seat, in order to have it had the on the runway capability, had to go fast and shoot you high. So they figured there was a good chance he broke his back, and if he landed in Georgia Strait with a broken back, that was game over.
Oh, yeah.
Callahan, when he was talking about it, said, I was coming down in the parachute and life was good, and then I heard this swish, swish, and he said, I thought, thank God I'm landing in the trees. No, John, it wasn't the trees. It was the combers in the Georgia Strait.
Yeah.
And he came down into a wild old Georgia Strait there, and he managed to inflate his dinghy and get into it. I'm not sure if he got into it or not. It escapes me. Anyway, and the reason for the double flameout was also very interesting. On the CF-100, on the left console, up in the dark, out of your normal scan, were two rotary switches, which were wing direct switches. And if you selected from normal to wing direct, you fed the engines from the wing tanks. Now, the CF-100 fuel system, what you had in front of you for normal operations was a totalizer. You had, if there was 8,000 pounds of fuel on board, which was roughly what it was full, that would be the combination of the fuselage tanks and the wing tanks. The fuselage tanks fed the engines, the wing tanks fed the fuselage tanks. The totalizer had a low fuel warning at 600 pounds. But when the thing was on wing direct, the wing engine went direct to the wing tank went directly to the engine. You had no indication in the cockpit. You had no idea unless you had actually either looked at these switches that you can't see, or you had felt them to see if they were in the right position. After many hours on the airplane, never in my life did I ever look at them or feel for them. They were always in normal. Why would anybody have them in wing direct? But on that night, we thought everything said they were at wing direct. The engines flamed out at exactly the time when the wing tanks would have been dry. There would have been no low fuel level warning because the fuselage tanks were full. The totalizer told him the aircraft had whatever it was, 4,000 pounds of fuel remaining. He had no idea. And then the engines flamed out, and when he tried to relight them, nothing happened.
Of course, because they weren't getting any.
They weren't getting any fuel, and they ejected quite properly. So, at the time, the thinking was after that accident, there was only two possibilities for the wing direct to be in the direct position. One was a maintenance check where they forgot to put it back, but that is not a maintenance check that would be done routinely. That would be on a major overhaul maintenance check. A maintenance check would not have been done unless there was some weird circumstance. The only other possibility was sabotage.
Really?
Yeah.
So it wasn't like a switch that a pilot could accidentally bump or something like that.
Absolutely
Okay.
not. They're way on the left console, way up in here.
You got to really try to.
You've
Okay.
gotta
So whoever
try.
did that knew what they were doing and did it purposely, either for
Yeah,
legitimate reasons or nefarious.
or some kind of tomfoolery. I don't know, but because they didn't bother to recover the airplane because they didn't even know where it was. The results of, like, I got the accident report, and they just said obscure because there was no convincing evidence.
Yeah, of course.
And they were not going to spend a lot of money to recover the airplane.
Yeah, especially they don't know where it is.
Well, they could, they would have found it, but it would have cost a bundle. And aircraft accidents and fatalities were a dime a dozen. Like the book says, there were 128 aircrew lost their lives during the Cold War in all-weather fighters. We had, when I was at Canuck, we had 5 fatalities, roughly.
So that's something that goes kind of, I feel, unsaid a lot in the conversation about Canada's Cold War contribution, is that we sacrificed quite a few aircrew for a small country. Like someone in the United States, whatever, might think, 127 aircrews, that's not much. Canada was a small nation. I mean, it still is, but we have, 15 million population?
Well, 128 is quite a number. The thing is, you have to remember that it was the opening of the jet age.
Yes.
There was the learning curve was steep.
Yes.
A lot of stupid mistakes were made because people didn't know. The fatality rate in the Sabres was, I think, just as high, although I don't know what it was.
I think in the Vampire, too. The Vampire, because it was the first one. That
and the
been...
Brits in the Meteors, they were falling like icicles. All sorts of problems and problems with their design problems that turned up. By the time we got to the CF-100 Mark V, I don't recall any design problems, which is unheard of. It was so amazing. I should say a couple of things about the genesis of the CF-100.
Please do.
So in World War II, Canada punched way above its weight.
Yes.
In the air, on the sea, and on the ground. Our troops were known for their capabilities as soldiers. Our Navy, I think, was the 3rd largest in the world in number of ships. Certainly not in tonnage, but we were in the anti-submarine business. And the RCIF was everywhere, and we had a bomber group, meaning a whole bomber operation in England, based up in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. And there were Canadian pilots throughout the RAF in Burma, and everywhere the RAF was, there were Canadian aircraft.
My grandfather was one of them.
And our boss at Comox Bridges was a Canadian flying with an RAF bomber squadron. So they punched way above their weight, but it's a simple fact. For example, the Canadian bomber squadrons were flying Halifaxes, second best. The best was the Lancaster. It carried the biggest load. It had the fewest problems. It was the best. But as anybody would expect, the Brits equipped their own Air Force and people with Lancasters.
Mm-hmm.
The Canadians got second, which was the Halifax, which many people thought was a wonderful bomber, but it had problems. It had design problems, and people who knew were not happy. And Canadian squadrons were often equipped with Hurricanes instead of Spitfires, but not always, and so on and so forth. So in 1948, when the first military specifications for the CF-100 came out, part of the thinking was we no longer want our aircrew to be flying second best, and as long as we're relying on other countries to equip us because we're not good enough to make our own airplanes, we will always be flying second best, and we will suffer casualties because of that, and we will suffer lack of effectiveness because of that. Therefore, things have changed. After the war, there was a lot of confidence, and they put a military spec out for the CF-100. Didn't have enough engineers to design it, and so they brought in engineers from the UK by the boatload, and they were very good. We had some excellent Canadians in the mix as well, and the idea was they were going to build an airplane that would be first rate, and so as it turned out, it was. When I was flying CF-100s, the Americans had the F-89, a dog of an old airplane. It couldn't shine the CF-100 shoes, and I don't know. The Brits had they didn't have the Javelins by then. They were still flying Meteors, to the best of my knowledge, or the Meteor wasn't even close. These were all behind by a bunch. The CF-100 was great, but the technology was changing fast. And the Americans were getting smarter every day, and by the time the late 50s rolled around, the Americans had the Century Series airplanes flying everywhere, and the F-86 was an obsolete, useless piece of an antique.
So if you think of it from that time, like our Vampire, which was the first operational jet fighter for the RF and the RCF, first flew in 1943.
Yep.
Straight wing, subsonic.
Yep.
You know, it was outclassed within 5 years of it coming out, easily.
Oh, yes.
And you think of it, went from 1943 when the first RF jet flew, to, let's say, 20 years later, 1963, and you've got Mach 2 interceptors in the form of the F-104 and the F-4, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
So I think a lot of people of my generation who maybe haven't really studied it, we don't realize how quickly things advanced.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And it was just, and you guys especially were on the bleeding edge of that. You know, like you started off on a base CF-100 is basically a straight wing jet.
Yep.
And then I know you went on to other airplanes which were swept wing, etc. And just learning that whole aerodynamic and that aerodynamic curve was a lot of, go out, fly the airplane. Oh, that didn't work. Let's go try something else. Whereas we don't think of that these days.
It was a very exciting era to be a pilot.
Yeah.
And another thing that changed a lot was weapons. Like, that was pathetic, arming an airplane in the 1950s with 50 caliber machine guns.
Yes.
They were gone. It reminds you of the Brits at the beginning of World War II, who I think it's because they had supply depots full of 303 ammunition from World War I don't know. But
probably good guess.
The poor bloody Spitfire, and I'm not so sure if the Hurricane had the Spitfire, and they were so proud of it, had 8 303 machine guns The Jerry's had, I believe, at the Battle of Britain, a 20 millimeter cannon firing through the hub of the straight ahead, and a couple of, I think, might have been 50 calibers and close to it. The Jerry's had self-sealing fuel tanks. And the Brits, these 303s were like pea shooters. And not only that, but they weighed down the air. But can you imagine 8 bloody machine guns
With all that ammunition.
and a boatload of ammunition so they could each fire for a while? And you practically had to get right on top of your target to do any damage. And when you did, the Jerry's had these self-sealing tanks. They had a bit of armor. The Brits had the RAF, I believe, had a non-self-sealing tank right in front of the pilot. So when it got hit, and the Jerry's were using incendiary bullets because they knew the RAF was not using self-sealing tanks. And how many pilots got either burned to death or horribly disfigured before they bailed out? It's unbelievable what and they were stuck because they had made all these decisions in peacetime, and suddenly the war was on. And they started redesigning, but it took a while.
Yeah, for sure.
And they got 20 millimeter cannons later. They got self-sealing tanks later. They got rid of the 303s later. But in the Battle of Britain and in the 1940s, everything was, in terms of weapons, second rate. So, and they still did very well, by the way.
Oh yes, absolutely. No, nothing but respect for the Brits.
Well, I do too. I've lived with the Brits and flew with them for a year.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
And I have nothing but admiration and respect for most of them.
Same
Not
here.
all.
Not all. No, I understand. I understand completely.
Yeah.
So the CF-100, it was only armed with rockets. You didn't have a gun on it.
Not on the Mark V.
Okay.
On the Marks that went to Europe, I believe they had what was called a gun pack underneath. They had a lot of troubles with the gun pack. I don't know what caliber weapons was in the gun pack. It wouldn't surprise me if it was 50 calibers, but I don't know. The gun pack, as far as I can know, was not very successful.
Okay.
Had a lot of problems. So.
I think some of the F4s even put gun packs on it. I don't think, from what I read.
Oh yeah, some of these guys had Gatling guns, which were hugely destructive.
Yeah.
Because they just put out a curtain of shots.
Exactly.
And poor old Doug's getting hungry over there.
No, he's good. He's smiling. He's enjoying every minute of it.